Today it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. We all know that the Salvation Army and the Rotary Club of Adelaide have had a long association. There's been some very eminent Salvation Army officers who've been members of this club, and we talk about retired Commissioner Donald Campbell and Vic Polk, and there's a few other people that many of you remember as members of this club. So we're really pleased that we continue to be members of this club and serve the Adelaide community, not just in what we do in the Salvation Army, but through also our membership of this club. Today I'm really pleased to introduce our territorial leaders for the Salvation Army in Australia, Commissioners Robert and Janine Donaldson. Commissioner Robert is the Territorial Commander for Australia, and Janine is the Territorial President of Women's Ministries, and together they share the spiritual leadership of the Salvation Army Australia. They were commissioned as Salvation Army officers in 1987, and they have served together as Salvation Army officers in their homeland of New Zealand, as well as Zambia, South Africa, and at international headquarters in London. Robert has held board appointments, including the Trustee for the Salvation Army International Trustee Company, Chair of the Board for the Salvation Army New Zealand, Fiji and Tonga, Chair of the Salvation Army International Moral and Social Issues Council, Member of the Board for the Salvation Army Southern Africa, Member of the Board for the Theological Education by Extension College South Africa, and a Member of the Board for the Heart Foundation of New Zealand. Robert has also led an international project encompassing the development and implementation of governance for the Salvation Army worldwide, and additionally he's a member of the New Zealand Institute of Directors and holds qualifications in science, theology and management. In fact, Robert didn't want me to say all that. He told me last night I was just to say they're just a couple of Kiwis doing their best in Australia. Okay, thank you. Now, Janine's appointment at international headquarters was the Zonal Secretary for Women's Ministries South Pacific and East Asia, and she was editor of the Revive magazine, which is an international magazine for women. Her other responsibilities have included board membership in New Zealand, Fiji and Tonga and South Africa, as well as appointments in women's ministries, personnel, recruitment, overseas development, officer training and corps. And prior to being Salvation Army officer, Janine was a qualified nurse. So they come to us very well qualified, very well experienced in the Salvation Army, and I'd like to ask you to welcome our guest Commissioners Robert and Janine Donaldson. And I believe that Commissioner Janine will start off the talk.
Well, how wonderful to be with you this afternoon. What a great group and what a fantastic setting that you enjoy fellowship and good food in this great ground, which even I've heard about. So that's great. We're very grateful that you have invited us here to be with you. It is a really great pleasure and privilege. We acknowledge Rotary International, as we have had the privilege of travelling around the world. We have many times both seen and heard what Rotary has contributed to the lives of thousands, and sincerely want to say thank you. And good just now to hear from my other Janine on the same table, how great is that, and Sam a little bit more of where money has gone to and to whom it is helping. So thank you very, very much for your generous spirits. I think it says a lot about you and indeed the country of Australia in the nearly 2 years Robert and I have been here to see just how generous Australians are, and we want to add our thanks to you. Now I'm going to start and Robert will follow me how it should be. Now, I understand that you too are merging two districts together, is that right, in Rotary? You're doing that at the moment, so you understand a little bit about merger, and that is what we are speaking to this afternoon. In 2018, the merger of two territories in the Salvation Army happened, and it was the biggest merger in Australia in that year. The opportunity was taken to ensure that the Salvation Army was positioned for a strong future, serving Australians as it has been doing for more than 140 years. You are probably well aware that the Salvation Army contributes to Australian society through a wide range of services, and I will just name just a few, such as emergency relief, money care, addictions and other drugs, vulnerable youth, disaster responses, housing, etc. And this is delivered by 9,000 employees, 800 Salvation Army officers and 30,000 volunteers, an extraordinary number, and part of our role has to be visit here in Adelaide and a little bit further out, many of our people serving, and I'm just quite overwhelmed actually by those that choose the Salvation Army to work from and the ministry that they give. It has an operating turnover of more than $1 billion. And in our merger in 2018, the Salvation Army took the opportunity to make multiple improvements in one go. It was extremely brave, and I actually really honour that decision. As you know, with merging, it's never particularly simple. It can even look better on paper than it can when you actually come to do it. What did we want to do in particular? Well, we often think of it as joining two Salvation Armies together to be one in Australia, but it was more than that. We took the opportunity to redefine the mission for contemporary Australia, and our restructure took place to achieve that mission. Again, a few words to explain a huge process. Also, the merger was to develop governance in the Salvation Army, and again, I reiterate, to merge the two territories together.
Thank you. If you've had anything to do with mergers, you know how challenging that work is. One of the things that's really critical in a merger, and what we were at international headquarters at the time that Australia was working through this process, and the thing that we celebrated is that the first and primary focus was on why does the Salvation Army exist, and how do we serve Australia to the best of our ability today and into the future. So, rightly so, there's a lot of history for the Salvation Army, but it actually was about how do we serve contemporary Australia? How do we redefine our mission, sharpen our mission, so that we serve Australia well? And out of that, of course, came a new structure. Because if we've redefined the mission, then the next question is, what structure will bring about that mission the most effectively and efficiently? And again, if you have any background in organisational development and behaviour, you will understand that the Salvation Army in its history of 150 years was a military structure. That's why we're called an army. It was a command and control structure. And what it chose as the new management structure for the Salvation Army in Australia was actually 27 specialist streams, nationally managed, collaborated at the local level in order to achieve the mission. Now, that the skills required for the old model and the skills required for the new model are poles apart. So there's been a massive development experience for people within the movement, because 150 years of command and control, with all of its benefits but with all of its weaknesses, is quite something then to go into a model where the most key element of working is collaboration. rather than command and control. So if you can imagine that for an organisation with 9,000 employees, 800 plus active Salvation Army officers and 30,000 volunteers, to actually make that shift was enormous. So the culture piece has been significant, and I'm going to come to that towards the end. The other part that's been interesting for the Salvation Army, and this was actually my last role in the Salvation Army. My last role was initially to assist the Salvation Army internationally to agree on a theology of governance, a set of principles for governance, and then to start the implementation in 135 countries around the world, with 300 legal entities in 134 legislative environments, with 50 different types of legal registration. So that was the complexity that we were working in, and trying to move again from a command and control structure into a modern governance situation. And that was my last job. And my first client in that consulting role that I had was Australia. So it was a great pleasure to walk with the team as they worked through the complexity of what should governance for the Salvation Army in Australia look like. Now, you would say, well, that shouldn't be too difficult. Well, the complexity for the Salvation Army is we choose because we believe that our mission must remain integrated and holistic. So our social services and our church sit under the same board and the same legal registration. So most churches have separated their social services off into a separate foundation or multiple foundations, and then they have their church structure with its own governance and leadership over here, and they work together. As a Salvation Army, we believe that our existence is about keeping those things together. That's how we best help the most disadvantaged, is keeping all of our social services and our spiritual evangelical work completely integrated so that we work with people in their completeness, in their wholeness. So how do you design a governance structure that the church will look up to and say, well, this is our church leadership, but will also meet the governance requirements of running, a more than $1 billion turnover a year charity that is essentially working in the social service space. So that's been a massive journey for people. In the old command and control structure, my predecessors, the territorial commanders, they had all power and control. There were many advisory boards and management groups, but in the end, the territorial commander had the decision-making responsibility. Now, that's just not acceptable anyway, that one person should have that power and authority. But if you think about it in the church, people want to look up and say, well, there is our archbishop, or there is our, and in the Salvation Army, that was very much, people looked to a territorial commander. So both for the church and for all the social services, to look up now and say, oh, well, we have an independent board running our church. How the heck does that work? So it's quite amazing, really, what's been achieved. And then, of course, after working with Australia and helping develop the governance model, it had only been in place for 7 months when we arrived. I think our world leader, the General, just had a great sense of humour and said, well, you made it, go and play with it. So it's wonderful to actually be a part of now embedding that whole new structure into the Salvation Army. Of course, if you, and I'm sure you do, all of you will know about governance, but when you go back to what governance means, that the original language and the original meaning of the word governance means to steer. And that is, the first priority of the board of the Salvation Army is to ensure that the Salvation Army is going in the right direction to achieve the mission that it is stated. And all of these parts all achieve that. So we have a great board. It's now been effective for 2.5 years. It's really maturing. We have some excellent directors on the board and who really get the heart of the Salvation Army and are providing superb level of governance. So the final bit that I'll just make comment on, because I think this is the hardest bit of all of that. You can change structures, and if people don't like it, sadly sometimes they'll choose to move on, or they'll fight you hard enough that in the end you'll invite them to move on. And gradually you'll adjust to your new structure. But the Salvation Army is 150 years old, with a deeply embedded set of values and a culture that has almost cemented itself in place. And so we're actually asking for that culture to change. And that is the most difficult part of this change process. The mechanics of it, the structure of it, you can do. The two former territories in Australia had more than 600 policies and processes between them, none of which were compatible. It's one thing we've learned about Australia: you really don't like each other much, do you? Oh, my goodness, state by state, boxing gloves are on, and even when you get in here, it's, what is it here, Crows versus Port or something? My goodness. See, I'm a Kiwi, we've not got enough people to fight that much, you see. You end up fighting with your neighbour. But changing the culture. When people, it's been their church, it's been their community service, it's been the heart of who they are, to say we're going to behave differently and we're going to do things differently and different people are going to have decision making. There's all sorts of things that have come into it. So one of the things, and I'd ask you not to talk about this outside, but I'll give it to you as our most critical example. Our officers are our trained ministers and frontline leaders. And in this whole process of bringing it together, with a much larger now Salvation Army territory, what we're wrestling with at the moment is a great sense of loss of identity, a loss of place and purpose within the movement. They used to know their local leader extremely well and have very close relationship. Now, Lance here, he's responsible for South Australia and Northern Territory, just one unit. So all of these frontline officers, there's all sorts of challenges about, well, who are we in this movement before? We used to own this outfit. We used to lead this outfit. Now it's all joined together and it's huge, and who are we? What is our place? Are we known? Are we valued? Etc., etc. The culture process is really challenging in that space. Because in many of our social services, we're hiring professionals into there, and they're coming in and they go, okay, this is the structure, we get on with it. But those whose lives have been embedded in it and massive change, there's significant stuff going on. And as Rotary looks at changes, and I've been a Rotarian in the past, there are some very, very deeply held convictions and values and the reason you exist. I think I would just encourage you to be open-minded, and certainly don't stamp your feet about things that don't matter. If I can give you any advice, don't stamp your feet about things that don't matter, because it is about Rotary serving Australia into the future. Yes, the past is important, but we can only serve into the future. So it's been a real challenge. If I can make a recommendation to you, is a wonderful practitioner who's based in Melbourne, Her name is Siobhan McHale, and I think she's written the most helpful book on culture change for organisations. It's only 18 months, 2 years old from publication, and it is an excellent read about how you go about culture change, and we're using it as a bit of a step guide in our process. So look, thank you for listening to us. The Salvation Army is here to serve Australia for years ahead, and whilst we've still got a lot of wrinkles to iron out, we believe that the decisions that have been made will set the Salvation Army up for a very strong future of serving the Australian community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that insight as to merging the two territories together. I'm going to take away that one thing: don't stamp your feet on things that don't matter, because that's sometimes what we do, isn't it? We get hung up on that. It's an opportunity now for people in the meeting who would like to ask the Commissioner's question. So we have our first question here.
Thank you for a most interesting talk, and Rotary's been, as you say, mixed up with the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear
Yep.
me? How did you measure, in a $1 billion organisation, how did you measure your success and identify your failures in the past? And with the organisational change, how are you measuring success now?
Look, with all of the social service contracts that we have, like every contract, we have outcomes that are measured individually. So that's for each individual contract or social service area, that's relatively easy. Salvation Army is very broad in the numbers of services that we deliver. So trying to find national measures is actually quite challenging. But one of the things that they really focused on is the Salvation Army had clearly been successful in social service delivery because it had grown and grown and grown, and we were constantly being invited into new spaces. But like many churches, our church had been in decline for a while because it had got a bit, it had stayed a little bit, if I can use the language, in a bit of a traditional rut in many places, and was not appealing and not attractive and not flexible. And so the whole idea of, if we're going to deliver holistic mission for whole people, we've got to push these things closer together. And so one of our measures now, and we're still working on the national big measures, because we've still got a bit of pruning to go until this movement is at a sustainable size. The key thing for us is how we measure how we're delivering this whole thing together, which is about pushing the two parts that were a bit independent for a while more closely together. Haven't answered it exactly because we're not actually there completely yet.
Yeah, thank you. I reiterate Rotarian John's comments about the excellence of your address. I just want to share with you quickly, firstly, that I had Lance's role some years ago with our professional body, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Australia. In 2016, we became the Institute of Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, acronym CAANZ, not to be confused with one of our big banks. But I've got a question, and it's not about the fact that we predated the Salvation Army in this merger across the ditch, but I will comment that we're one of the first professional bodies in the world to do that. And it was deemed to be very successful, albeit that some of our members complained that, notwithstanding the fact that membership fees went down a little bit, perhaps the services aren't quite as good. But we can't have the apple and eat all the time. But my question was going to be perhaps some commentary around modern social media and what sort of challenge you see that it's presenting not just to the Salvation Army, but to society in general, because I think we're all witnessing that day by day at the moment in a bit of an unfolding catastrophe, and I just would appreciate your comments and perhaps your wife's comments as well in that regard. Thank you.
Look, we use social media extensively in the Salvation Army, especially, well, internally and externally. In fact, Daryl over here he's part of our Others magazine, which is really our internal online publication. Three stories go up every day on that portal, everything from what's going on to, I think my greatest concern around social media is how we can be in workplaces with the highest levels of compliance we've ever had around respect and relationships and how we work together and etc. And it seems that it's got to be the same group of people, because we go to work, we go home. And people go home, and on social media, it's like there's a whole different set of behaviours, and it's the same people. I don't understand that disconnect, and we certainly, within our movement, if we see that disconnect in our own people, we deal with that quite swiftly, because it's abusive, it's toxic, it's. We know, every time there's a new bushfire appeal goes up for money, and you just get slammed with well, you didn't spend the last lot, blah blah blah. Doesn't matter how many audited reports you put out to show that you've done it properly. It's ongoing. Or that it's ongoing. People just they want to take it and they'll say what they like on social media. It's incredibly challenging. There's sometimes I really burn with anger, and Janine counsels me to say nothing.
Yeah, I agree. I think years ago, when we perhaps were writing letters, if we were writing something that we were annoyed about, we maybe slept on it. It was wise advice, wasn't it? Write your letter how you feel, but then don't send it immediately. I think we've lost some of that in the social media setting, where people just fire off without actually just thinking about the effects it might have, because very often so many other people are hurt, or when you put wrong information out, it's then so much harder to correct that information, as you know.
We have one more question from David Egan.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine and Robert. Really enjoyed your address. And as I was saying to you earlier, Robert, Rotary is looking at international change and facing some of those same challenges, in particular the challenge of people that have sort of grown in a system and they're invested in their future roles in the organisation, particularly our district governors, which I'm a past one, glad to say, past. And when you're bringing in change, they're looking forward to being what they've grown up with. And if you're going to bring something new in and they're vested in that, there is a huge challenge. I'm just wondering, perhaps Janine as well, have you struck that problem, and well, you obviously have from what you said, but how do you overcome it, and how do you get them focused on the new behaviours and collaboration and all that sort of thing?
Good question. I think it's about that's cultural change that Robert referred to, and for our Salvation Army officers, that part of it is we sign a covenant. We're not employees. We sign a covenant with God, and we work out of those promises that we have signed up for. And I think for that part, it's about drawing attention to what nobody made you sign. You did that of your own free will, and reminding people of those promises that you made. I think it's heartening for employees because they know the Salvation Army is a Christian movement. That's stated. That's I don't think in Australia, but in New Zealand I love it because in some of our government contracts, it's in our government contracts. Make no mistake, that's our first priority. And I think for those wonderful volunteers we have and employees, they choose to sign up for that. And I think that's amazing. that's their heart. Doesn't matter where they're from, what culture, they choose to work with us. But it is going about that culture piece, which is the piece we are working on and believing for in the future.
I think one of the things we've identified, and we're only on this journey, so we're not through this, but we have certainly identified that lack of, or, the possible changes that then change people's aspirations or block those. And we recognise that actually in that we have to deal with the grief and the loss of that, and then redirect the energy and the passion, or not redirect, invite people to express that in another way. But, Lances in Australia, there were previously, I think, 18 or 19 divisional commanders. That Salvation Army officers, some of them aspired to be a divisional commander. It's an influential role and an important role. There's now only 6. So a lot of people, their aspirations aren't going to be met. So it is about grief and loss and reality and honesty and good conversations, and help people work through it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Just hold on. Commissioners Robert and Janine, we want to thank you for sharing with us today. What a privilege it is for us to have you speak with us. We'd like to show our appreciation by giving you this certificate. A donation has been made on your behalf from the Rotary Club of Adelaide for local community and youth projects.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Would you like to thank the commissioners?